The cruelest predictions are often made seconds before fate decides to interrupt. I used to think heartbreak had a sound. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the shattering crash people described in movies. It was softer than that, almost polite, like crystal glasses clinking beneath expensive chandeliers while someone smiled as they quietly dismantled your dignity. The ballroom shimmered beneath warm golden lights, every table wrapped in white linen, every guest dressed like they belonged on magazine covers instead of ordinary life. I didn't belong there anymore. Maybe I never had. 6 months earlier, I had imagined standing in that same room beside Ethan Brooks, planning our future together. Tonight, I stood alone near the back wall wearing the only navy dress I could still afford after rebuilding my life from scratch. I adjusted the silver bracelet my mother had left me, pretending I wasn't counting the exits. Friends I had known for years looked through me with practiced smiles. Some nodded politely. Others whispered behind raised champagne flutes. I couldn't hear every word, but I didn't need to. Pity had its own language. My invitation had arrived because the bride was my college roommate. She insisted I come despite everything that had happened. I wanted to support her. I truly did. I just hadn't expected Ethan to be there with the confidence of a man who believed the world had already chosen his side. He spotted me before I could slip toward another corner. His grin spread slowly, drawing curious eyes from the people gathered around him. Conversations faded into uncomfortable silence as he crossed the marble floor with effortless confidence. Expensive tuxedo perfectly tailored, every step reminding me why everyone had once admired him. He stopped only a few feet away. "Claire," he said, almost warmly, as if we were old friends instead of strangers stitched together by old scars. I offered a polite smile. "Congratulations on your promotion," I said quietly. His friends exchanged amused glances. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Still pretending everything worked out for you." A few nervous laughs escaped nearby. I felt heat creep into my face, but I refused to look down. "I'm doing just fine." He tilted his head, studying me with the confidence of someone certain he already knew the ending. No ring, no date, no future. His voice carried farther than he probably intended, or maybe exactly as far as he wanted. More faces turned toward us. Then he smiled wider and delivered the sentence that seemed to freeze the air itself. "You'll die alone." Laughter rippled across the room. Not loud, not cruel enough to make anyone feel guilty, just enough to make me realize how easily people confuse silence with agreement. I swallowed the lump in my throat and reminded myself to breathe. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. Then, without warning, every conversation stopped. Outside the towering glass windows, a line of identical black SUVs rolled beneath the hotel entrance, and the entire room instinctively turned toward the doors. The first thing I noticed was not the vehicles themselves, but the reaction they caused. Valets who had been chatting casually straightened their jackets. Hotel staff quietly stepped into perfect formation. Even the wedding coordinator stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence. It was as if everyone had rehearsed for someone important without telling the guests who that someone would be. Ethan frowned beside me, his confidence interrupted for the first time all evening. The ballroom doors opened before anyone reached them. For men in dark tailored suits entered first, not rushing, not searching the room with suspicion, simply moving with the calm precision of people who knew exactly where they belonged. Then he walked in. He was taller than I expected, wearing a charcoal suit with no flashy accessories, only a classic watch beneath the cuff of his crisp white shirt. His dark hair was neatly combed, his expression unreadable, his posture effortless. He did not need to announce himself because the silence around him already had. I had never seen him before, yet something about the room changed the moment he crossed the marble floor. Guests who had ignored me minutes earlier suddenly lowered their voices. A local business executive I recognized from magazine covers immediately stepped aside. The owner of the hotel approached him with a respectful nod that looked almost instinctive. Whoever this man was, he carried influence that could not be purchased overnight. I looked away, assuming he had nothing to do with me. People like him existed in newspapers and television interviews, not in the ordinary corners of my life. I told myself to leave before Ethan found another audience. My fingers tightened around the strap of my handbag as I quietly stepped toward the side hallway. Then I heard measured footsteps behind me. They did not hurry. They did not hesitate. They simply came closer until they stopped a few feet away. I turned, expecting a member of the hotel staff. Instead, I found those calm gray eyes looking directly into mine. For a long second, neither of us spoke. There was no recognition on my face, only confusion, but his expression carried the faintest trace of familiarity, as though he had already lived this moment many times in his thoughts. He studied me with remarkable gentleness, not the way strangers usually look at one another, but the way someone searches for proof that a memory was real. My heartbeat grew louder than the music drifting through the ballroom. Around us, conversations refused to restart. Every guest seemed to be watching without pretending otherwise. Ethan stepped forward, forcing an awkward smile. "Can I help you?" he asked, trying to reclaim the attention that had slipped away. The stranger never glanced in his direction. His eyes remained on mine as though no one else occupied the room. Then, with quiet certainty that somehow reached every corner of the ballroom, he extended his hand toward me, and in a voice steady enough to silence every remaining whisper, he said, "Claire Anderson, I have been looking for you." I stared at the hand extended toward me, convinced he had mistaken me for someone else. "I think you have the wrong person," I whispered, my voice barely louder than my own heartbeat. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, restrained and genuine, as though he had expected that answer. "No," he replied calmly. "I spent months making sure I would never make that mistake." The room remained perfectly still. Even the string quartet had stopped playing without anyone asking them to. I glanced around, searching for an explanation hidden somewhere among the stunned faces surrounding us. But every expression reflected the same confusion I felt. Ethan laughed uneasily, taking another step forward. "Claire, do you know this guy?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. "No," I admitted honestly. "I do not think I do." The stranger nodded, completely accepting my answer. "That is understandable," he said. "We only met once. You had no reason to remember me. I had every reason to remember you." His words settled over me like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. I searched his face again, hoping recognition would suddenly appear, but there was nothing. No memory, no familiar voice, no forgotten afternoon. Only the strange certainty in his eyes that made me question my own recollection. He lowered his hand slightly, giving me room instead of pressure. That single gesture somehow made me trust him more. Powerful people usually expected immediate obedience. This man waited. Ethan forced another laugh, louder this time. "Well, this has been entertaining, but we were in the middle of a conversation." For the first time, the stranger slowly turned his head toward him. His expression did not harden. It simply became distant, as though Ethan had become another detail in the room rather than its center. "I am aware," he answered evenly. "I heard enough." Ethan straightened his shoulders. "And who exactly are you?" Before the stranger could answer, the hotel owner hurried forward with visible respect. "Mr. DeLuca," he said quietly, "if there is anything you require this evening, my staff and I are completely at your service." A wave of whispers spread through the ballroom. I heard his name repeated from one table to another. Adrian DeLuca. The name meant nothing to me, but it clearly meant everything to everyone else. Ethan's confidence faded almost imperceptibly. Several guests who had been standing beside him casually stepped away, creating a small empty space around him without saying a word. Adrian looked back at me, his voice returning to the same calm warmth. "Claire, I came because I owed you something long before tonight." I frowned. "You owe me nothing." His eyes softened. "You gave kindness without asking who deserved it. That is a debt I have never forgotten." Then he offered his hand once more, not as a command, but as an invitation, and somehow I felt that accepting it would change the direction of my life forever. For several long seconds, I simply looked at Adrian's hand, wondering how one quiet gesture could outweigh every cruel word that had been spoken only moments earlier. My instincts told me to protect myself. My heart reminded me that not every outstretched hand came with hidden conditions. Slowly, I placed my hand in his. His grip was steady, respectful, and brief, as though his purpose was never to possess my trust but to earn it. The smallest movement seemed to ripple through the ballroom. I heard another wave of whispers spreading from table to table. Guests who had barely acknowledged my existence earlier were suddenly watching me, as though they had forgotten everything they thought they knew. Ethan's smile finally disappeared. "Claire," he said sharply, "what exactly is this?" I turned toward him, prepared to admit that I was just as confused, but Adrian spoke first. His voice remained calm enough that no one had to strain to hear him. This is someone who deserves far more respect than she has been shown tonight. There was no anger in his words. No accusation. Somehow that made them impossible to argue with. Ethan folded his arms. You barely know her. Adrian met his gaze without the slightest change in expression. Knowing someone's character does not always require years. Sometimes one moment tells you everything. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument could have been. Several guests who had laughed at Ethan's joke now avoided looking at either of us. Others quietly lowered their champagne glasses. Even the bride looked uncomfortable, as though she wished she had stopped the conversation much sooner. Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a small velvet box. My breath caught. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he looked at me with the same patient certainty that had never once crossed into pressure. Claire, he said softly, I promised myself that if life ever allowed me to find you again, I would never let another day pass without thanking you properly. Confusion washed over me all over again. I still do not understand, I admitted. He nodded. You will. Soon. Only then did he open the box. Inside rested a simple platinum ring with a single elegant diamond that reflected the ballroom lights without excessive brilliance. It was beautiful because it did not need to prove that it was beautiful. Adrian turned toward the stunned crowd before returning his attention to me. Ladies and gentlemen, he said with quiet confidence, allow me to introduce the woman I intend to marry. A collective gasp swept through the room. Someone nearly dropped a glass. Ethan stared at us as though the world had suddenly begun speaking a language he could no longer understand. Adrian never looked away from me. This is not a performance, he continued gently. This is a promise I have waited far too long to keep. In that extraordinary moment, I realized the greatest reversal was not that the room had changed its opinion of me. It was that, for the first time in a very long time, I stopped seeing myself through the eyes of the people who had underestimated me. The ring remained inside its velvet box, untouched between us, yet somehow it had already changed the atmosphere more than if it had been placed on my finger. I could not take my eyes off Adrian. Every instinct told me this could not be real. Nothing about the evening had followed the rules life had taught me. Only minutes earlier, I had been standing alone, wondering how quickly I could disappear without anyone noticing. Now an entire ballroom waited for my answer, even though I did not yet know the question. I took a slow breath. Please, I said quietly, tell me how we know each other. Adrian's expression softened with unmistakable relief, as though he had hoped I would ask that before making any decision. He closed the ring box and slipped it back into his jacket. 6 months ago, he began, on a rainy Thursday afternoon, my car broke down outside a neighborhood bookstore in Westchester County. I frowned. A faint image stirred somewhere deep inside my memory. Rain tapping against windows. A man standing alone beneath a gray sky. Grocery bags. Coffee. Adrian continued before I could interrupt. Most people drove around me. A few stared. One person parked, walked through the rain with an umbrella, and asked if I needed help. Suddenly I remembered. He had worn a simple dark coat instead of an expensive suit. There had been no security team. No luxury convoy. Just a quiet stranger with a dead phone and a flat tire. I had offered him my umbrella because mine was large enough for both of us. Then I had insisted he take the last cup of hot coffee I had bought after work because he looked exhausted. He had tried to pay me. I had laughed and refused. You looked like you needed a little kindness more than I needed $4. I whispered without thinking. Adrian smiled for the first time that evening, and it completely transformed his face. Those were your exact words. My hand rose to my mouth. I had forgotten that moment almost as soon as I reached home. To me, it had been an ordinary act of courtesy. To him, it had become something entirely different. You waited with me for almost 40 minutes until roadside assistance arrived, he said. You were already late meeting someone, but you never complained. My chest tightened. That had been the evening Ethan became angry because I had arrived late for dinner. I had never told him why. He had never asked. Adrian looked directly into my eyes. You never asked my name. You never asked what I did for a living. You treated me with the same respect you would have given anyone else. Around us, the ballroom remained silent enough that every word carried clearly through the air. I hired people to find the woman who walked away without expecting anything in return, Adrian admitted. Not because I wanted to repay a favor with money, but because I wanted to know whether someone that genuine truly existed. Every answer I received only confirmed what I already believed. Tonight was never about rescuing you, Claire. It was about finally finding the person who reminded me that kindness still existed when I had almost stopped believing in it. My heart should have been overwhelmed by gratitude, yet another feeling rose even faster. Fear. I gently stepped back and let my hand slip away from Adrian's. Every pair of eyes in the ballroom followed the movement. I cannot accept this, I said honestly. Not like this. A shadow of disappointment crossed several faces around us, but Adrian remained perfectly composed. He simply listened. You searched for me because I showed you kindness one rainy afternoon, I continued. That does not mean you owe me your future. It certainly does not mean I should become part of yours. He nodded once, inviting me to finish. I spent too much of my life being treated like someone else's decision, I said quietly. I cannot become another one, even if the offer comes from someone I respect. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier silence. Before, people had been waiting for drama. Now they were listening for truth. Ethan gave a sarcastic laugh, clearly hoping the moment had finally collapsed. There it is, he muttered loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Reality finally showed up. Adrian never acknowledged him. His attention remained entirely on me. Claire, he said gently. Thank you. I blinked in surprise. Thank me? Yes. A faint smile returned to his face. Because you just proved everything I believed about you. I frowned, unable to understand. He continued. If you had accepted simply because of my reputation, I would have questioned whether I had misunderstood your character. Instead, you protected your own dignity before considering anything I could offer. That tells me I remembered you correctly. Those words settled somewhere deep inside me. He was not disappointed because I had refused. Somehow he seemed relieved. Adrian slowly removed the ring box from his pocket once more, looked at it for a brief moment, then calmly closed it again without opening it. This ring is not a contract, he said. It is not a reward, and it is certainly not payment for your kindness. He slipped the box back into his jacket. I will never ask you to stand beside me because you feel pressured, indebted, or impressed. Around us, the whispers disappeared completely. The ballroom had become so quiet that the soft melody from the grand piano drifting in from another room suddenly felt impossibly clear. Adrian took one respectful step backward, creating space between us instead of closing the distance. If you walk away tonight, he said, I will still be grateful that I found you. If we never meet again after this evening, I will still consider that rainy Thursday one of the luckiest days of my life. His words carried no desperation, only sincerity. Then he looked directly into my eyes and said something no one in that ballroom expected from the most powerful man present. Your answer matters because your freedom matters first. In that instant, I understood that true power was not measured by how many people could be commanded. It was measured by how completely someone respected another person's ability to choose. Adrian's words lingered in the silence long after he stopped speaking. No one rushed to fill the empty space. No one dared interrupt it. I looked around the ballroom and realized something had quietly changed. Earlier that evening, every eye had been measuring my worth through someone else's opinion. Now they were waiting to see how I would define it myself. That difference mattered more than I could explain. I turned back toward Adrian. Most people spend their lives trying to convince others they are valuable, I said softly. You are the first person who has acted as though I already was. He held my gaze with that same calm certainty. Because you were, he answered. Long before tonight. Long before I found you again. I felt an unfamiliar warmth replace the humiliation that had followed me into the ballroom. It was not because he was powerful. It was because he expected nothing in return for the respect he offered. Ethan stepped forward once again, his frustration no longer hidden behind confidence. Claire, you cannot seriously believe this, he said. You met him once for less than an hour. I slowly faced him. For the first time since we had spoken that evening, I noticed how desperately he wanted everyone else to agree with him. Months ago, I would have rushed to defend myself, hoping he would understand my intentions. Tonight, I simply smiled with quiet sadness. You are right, I said. I only met him once. Ethan nodded quickly, convinced I was finally returning to reason. Then I continued. But in less than an hour, he noticed my kindness, respected my choices, remembered my words, and thanked me without asking for anything in return. We were together for 3 years, Ethan, and somehow you never managed to do any of those things. A heavy silence settled over the guests. No one laughed this time. No one looked amused. Ethan opened his mouth, searching for another clever remark, but nothing came. There was nothing cruel enough to erase the truth once it had been spoken calmly. Adrian remained beside me without interrupting. He did not celebrate my words. He did not look triumphant. He simply allowed me to reclaim my own voice. That realization touched me more deeply than any grand declaration could have. I finally understood what had been different about him from the moment he entered the room. He had never tried to become the hero of my story. He had quietly made space for me to become the heroine of my own. I looked at him again and laughed softly through the emotion building behind my eyes. I still do not know where this path leads, I admitted. Neither do I, Adrian replied with an honest smile. The only thing I know is that every meaningful journey begins with two people choosing to walk, not one person pulling the other. For the first time that evening, I felt no pressure, no embarrassment, and no fear of being judged. I only felt the quiet freedom of standing beside someone who valued my heart before my answer. And somehow that was the moment I truly began to believe that my future no longer belonged to the people who had underestimated me. The ballroom slowly came back to life, but nothing felt the same anymore. Conversations resumed in careful whispers instead of confident laughter. Faces that had once dismissed me now carried expressions somewhere between curiosity and regret. It amazed me how quickly people adjusted their opinions when they witnessed someone else offering respect first. I did not feel victorious. If anything, I felt unexpectedly peaceful. I realized I no longer needed anyone in that room to apologize for what had happened earlier. Their approval had stopped being something I wanted the moment I remembered my own worth. Adrian stood beside me without speaking, giving me the silence I needed instead of filling it with promises. That simple restraint made me trust him more than endless compliments ever could. A few minutes later, my college roommate quietly approached us. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she reached for my hands. "Claire," she whispered, "I should have stopped everything when Ethan embarrassed you. I was afraid of ruining my wedding, and instead I almost ruined our friendship." I squeezed her hands gently. "You did not ruin it," I answered. "Sometimes people freeze because they do not know what to do. What matters is what they choose after that." Relief softened her face. She hugged me briefly before returning to her guests, lighter than she had looked all evening. Watching her walk away reminded me that forgiveness often frees the person offering it just as much as the person receiving it. Ethan remained near the edge of the ballroom, surrounded by an emptiness that had not been there before. His friends had drifted toward other conversations. No one openly rejected him. They simply stopped orbiting around him. After several long moments, he walked toward me with slower steps than I had ever seen from him. His confidence had been replaced by something quieter. "Claire," he said, avoiding my eyes for the first time in years, "I guess I never realized how much I took you for granted." I listened without interrupting. He exhaled slowly. "I thought success meant always being right. Somewhere along the way, I forgot how to be kind." I appreciated the honesty, but it no longer reached the part of my heart that once waited endlessly for those words. "I hope you become the man you are describing," I said sincerely. "But I cannot return to being the woman who accepted less than she deserved." He nodded once. There was sadness in his expression, but also acceptance. He understood that some doors closed quietly instead of dramatically. As he walked away, I did not feel anger. I only felt gratitude that life had finally taught both of us different lessons. Adrian looked at me with a gentle question in his eyes rather than on his lips. I smiled, took one small step closer, and this time it was my choice. "Would you still like to have that conversation you searched 6 months to begin?" I asked. His smile widened with quiet relief. "More than anything," he replied. Together we walked toward the ballroom doors, not because the evening had given either of us a perfect ending, but because it had offered us something far more valuable: the freedom to begin an honest future by our own choice. 3 months later, I found myself standing beneath a clear autumn sky instead of a crystal chandelier. The ceremony was held on a quiet estate outside the city, surrounded by maple trees whose golden leaves drifted gently across the stone pathway with every cool breeze. Adrian had insisted on keeping the guest list small. The people who celebrate your happiness should already know your heart, he had told me, not your last name. Looking around, I understood exactly what he meant. There were no cameras, no reporters, no extravagant spectacle designed to impress strangers. Only family, a handful of close friends, and the people who had proven through their actions that they deserved to witness this new chapter of our lives. I wore a simple ivory gown that felt more like myself than anything I had ever imagined wearing. Adrian waited for me beneath an old oak tree, looking at me with the same quiet respect he had shown from the very beginning. Nothing about him suggested ownership. Everything about him reflected gratitude. When I finally reached him, he smiled with that familiar warmth that had become my safest place. "You are here because you chose to be," he whispered. "Every step," I answered, smiling back, "was my own." The ceremony was short, but every promise felt lasting. We did not speak about forever as though it were guaranteed. We spoke about choosing one another again whenever tomorrow arrived. It sounded less romantic than the stories I had grown up hearing, yet somehow it felt far more real. Afterward, as music floated through the evening air and guests laughed over dinner, I noticed Ethan standing near the entrance. He had not come to interrupt anything. He simply offered a respectful nod from a distance before quietly leaving without expecting recognition. I returned the gesture with a small smile. Some endings did not require another conversation. They only required peace. Later that evening, Adrian and I walked through the gardens while tiny lights illuminated the pathways around us. He reached into his pocket and handed me something unexpected. It was the faded coffee shop receipt from that rainy Thursday 6 months earlier, carefully preserved inside a protective sleeve. $4.18. I laughed through happy tears. "You kept this?" I asked. He nodded. "Not because of the coffee," he said, "because it reminds me that the greatest changes in life rarely begin with grand gestures. They begin when someone chooses kindness without expecting applause." I slipped the receipt into my purse beside my mother's silver bracelet, realizing that both had become symbols of the same lesson. One reminded me where I came from. The other reminded me where compassion could lead. As the evening settled into comfortable silence, I finally understood that the greatest gift Adrian had ever given me was never the ring, his influence, or the future we were building together. It was the certainty that my value had never depended on the people who failed to see it. The right person does not create your worth. They simply recognize the worth that was always there. And sometimes the quietest act of respect becomes the moment that changes an entire life.